The early 90s saw one of the most legendary events in video game history. Something truly amazing. Something still talked about to this very day. The creation of Action 52! Just kidding. But it actually did lead to one of the most epic and still talked about console wars ever. In the range of consoles that had come out in that period, of which there were many that we may talk about in future videos, only two reigned supreme, and the companies behind these two behemoths battled for dominance over the North American market. More than we usually battle with the internal struggle of if we actually need that third slice of the pie. You don't need it, man. In schools and playgrounds across the United States and great glorious nation of Canada, sides were taken, debates were heated, friendships were tested, and petty schoolyard fights broke out. And I wasn't around for any of it. Mainly due to the fact that when I was born, the Super Nintendo had just come out in North America. So, while my first systems were the NES and the SNES, and I did enjoy them immensely, by the time I was old enough to see the schoolyard scraps, the PlayStation 1 and the Saturn were out. So, yeah, missed out on that. I had to settle for Pokemania, GoldenEye, and the rise of 3D graphics. Oh god, early 3D graphics. But hey, enough about that. Let's talk about these two consoles, and why they were the dominant systems in North America, their intense competition, and why other systems failed to match up with these two. Though, you can probably guess why just by looking at them. But before we get to all that, we have to get to the root of how the 4th gen console war blew up to be the big and infamous conflict that it was. And this story has its start all the way back in the 2nd generation of consoles. So we'll hop in our DeLorean and head back in time. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of people are familiar with the video game crash of 1983. If you're not, then, well, there's probably hundreds of other videos you can watch about it. It was an event that nearly killed off gaming as a whole, almost leaving it as nothing more than a mere fad. There are many reasons as to how this event came to be, including lack of publishing control that led to a glut of terrible games, inflation, high-profile failures such as Pac-Man and E.T. for the Atari 2600, which I actually played, but we don't talk about that game.
I don't know if you really want to get into what you find in the trash.
Competition from home computers, and an oversaturated console market. Now, get ready to hear about this a lot, because it's going to be a regular reference point in this channel's videos, as a lot of things that exist in the current market of video games can claim some root in this great event. When people think of the 2nd generation, there are 3 consoles that generally come to mind, and those would be the Atari 2600, the Mattel Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. However, there were far more consoles than that, a metric buttload more. There was the Poly Astrocade, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, the Fairchild Channel F, the Emerson Arcadia 2001, the Vectrex. Even Atari released a second console that gen, the Atari 5200, so it could replace the 2600 with a system that could beat or match the ColecoVision in the graphics department. This, of course, failed miserably, especially as it had just come out before the crash. And I haven't even listed all of them. There were more, but for the sake of saving time, I'm just gonna move on, because I think you get the general idea, and nobody wants to hear more about crap game consoles. Anyway, the crash hit, and it seemed like that was it for the industry. That was until glorious Nintendo came along to bring their beloved Famicom to the West. Mercy was bestowed upon us peasants in the form of amazing gaming from a benevolent god. Of course, Nintendo faced several hurdles. When they announced that they were going to bring the Famicom over as the advanced video system, they were faced with a lot of criticism. Retailers at the time refused Nintendo's offers to stock the console as they saw it as wasted revenue that would not sell, and the gaming press at the time said Nintendo would fail as the video game market had entirely disappeared in America. That and the name Advanced Video System, I mean, come on! I don't even need to have to put a joke in here. The name is a joke in and of itself. Because of this, Nintendo went back to the drawing board to revise their strategy on bringing the Famicom, or Advanced Video System, to North America. In an effort to boost the confidence of retailers in America that this thing could sell, they made several changes to their marketing strategy. First, they changed the name from the Advanced Video System and referred to the console as an entertainment system. Then, they called their cartridges game packs instead of video games. I don't know how that helped anything. I'd say it's still a dead giveaway that this is a game console and not something else. Referred to the system as a control deck instead of a console. Redesigned the console to resemble a VCR instead of a typical video game system. A strategy that didn't work for Microsoft several decades later. Sold the system with Rob the Robot so they could market the system as a toy instead of a game console. Of course, they ditched Rob after the console started selling since it only worked with 2 games and was barely functional. Seriously, if you want to see how crap that thing was, James Rolfe did an entire episode on it. There was also going to be a deal with Atari so that they could sell the console under the Atari name for brand recognition to help the system sell. But when Atari saw that Nintendo had ported Donkey Kong to a competitor's system while these talks were going on, Atari was furious and the deal fell apart. This would come back to bite Atari later. Funny enough, this would actually start a long trend of Nintendo starting deals with other companies and ducking out at the last minute, but we'll get to that in a bit. All of this somehow fooled retailers into thinking the system was something it wasn't, and they sold it, proving how astronomically dumb many of them were. Of course, you know the NES took off and became a massive success, reviving the game industry as we know it. Of course, at the time that came with a price. Nintendo was well aware of the issues that led to the video game crash and took steps to prevent them from happening again. To prevent a glut of poor quality games from coming to the system, they adopted a strict licensing policy towards third-party developers. Any games third parties planned to bring to the system had to get Nintendo's approval first, hence the seal of quality found on the boxes and cartridges of most games. Mind you, this didn't stop a lot of garbage games from coming to the system. Looking at you, LJN. They also could only publish 5 games per year, and had to order at least 10,000 cartridges to sell, and also had to abide by a strict censorship policy in which blood, nudity, and religious symbols, among other things, had to be censored or changed, due to the console being primarily marketed towards children. But this didn't stop third-party devs from marketing games based on R-rated movies to kids. Take Friday the 13th for example. A homicidal maniac that goes around brutally butchering teens at a summer camp? Fun for the whole family! And, most importantly, third parties could only make games exclusively for Nintendo. This gave Nintendo a stranglehold on the North American market. One could even say that they had a monopoly, as competitors couldn't stand a chance. Though, as we're going to find out, they didn't really try that hard anyway. Atari attempted to make a comeback with the 7800 to challenge the NES, but unfortunately, their library lacked the variety of games the NES had. While the NES had platformers, action, arcade, adventure games, point-and-click, puzzles, and RPGs, the 7800's library was made up almost exclusively of old arcade games. Games that they had already released on the 2600 and 5200, only with prettier graphics, making them look dated, worn out, and tired on arrival. Atari really should have just taken up that deal with Nintendo, as their failures only continued from there. And here's where Sega enters the picture. Sega had its own system to compete in the form of the Master System, but due to Nintendo locking publishers into exclusivity deals, the Master System, despite having better specs than that of the NES, couldn't even gain a foothold in the American market, nor could it even gain a significant one in Japan. While it did have some good games on its own, it could never hope to stand up against the juggernaut that was the NES. However, while it did fail in North America and Japan, it did find success in Europe, and it ended up dominating the market in Brazil later in 1989. So, not everything was doom and gloom for the system. However, its inability to capture the Japanese market left the higher-ups at Sega so frustrated that they started working on a successor almost immediately after the Master System's launch. Talk about not having much faith in your own system. But this was a trend that you're going to find was quite common for Sega.
What's the hottest 16-bit video game system with true arcade games, great graphics, real challenge, stereo sound, and the hottest library too, with games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Super Hang-On, Forgotten World, Space Harrier 2, Revenge of Shinobi, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Buxton, Last Battle, Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, Super Thunderblade, Zoom, Thunder Force 2, Ghouls and Ghosts, Mystic Defender, Rambo 3, and more. Genesis from Sega. Genesis, the new generation in video games.
In 1988, the first 16-bit console, the Sega Mega Drive, came out in Japan, and with it, plans to release it in the West. Only one issue. Sega didn't have an American sales and marketing department like Nintendo did. Instead, they had released the Master System through another company, and as the company in question, Tonka, didn't do a good job with the Master System, Sega decided to take their business elsewhere. So, they tried making a deal with Atari to release the system, much like Nintendo did, but Atari deemed the system too expensive and promptly turned it down. Chalk this up to another terrible mistake by Atari. They had two chances to make some major money, and they blew both of them in favor of going with their own ideas that failed miserably. After that, Sega decided to self-publish the now named Genesis through Sega of America, and set up a new marketing and sales department. In 1989, Sega launched the Genesis. Marketing took aim at the NES, and the console war began.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo don't? Buy a 16-bit Genesis system between now and October 31st and get an extra game.
Now, you may be looking at this and are probably thinking, wait, hold on now. A next-gen console attacking a last-gen console that is going to be on its way out? That's pathetic. That would be like Microsoft launching the Xbox One and boasting how it's better than the PS3, even though the PS3's hardware would be obsolete in comparison. Keep in mind that at the time, gaming as a medium was still very young, and the concept of console generations hadn't even been a thought back then. Even Nintendo didn't really start the development of the Super Famicom until they saw both the Mega Drive and NEC's PC engine catching up to the NES in Japan. And when they did finally release the Super Nintendo, it was considered to be a major controversy by the press. But, as I was saying, at that time, Sega considered Nintendo's NES to be the main competition, and that by releasing a more advanced console, it would be their time to dominate the industry. Their strategy to gain a foothold in the market was to show off how powerful their new 16-bit console was superior to the 8-bit NES and create a library that consumers would recognize and flock to. And nothing says instant recognition like attaching celebrities to a game. Games like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, Pat Riley's Basketball, Joe Montana Football, and James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. This approach wasn't exactly working as the NES still remained the dominant console in Canada and the US. Dissatisfied with the results, Sega replaced the CEO of Sega of America, Michael Katz, with Tom Kalinske. This time around, Kalinske thought of a new plan. Slash the price of the Genesis, which was $189 at the time, replace Altered Beast with Sonic the Hedgehog as a pack-in game, continue the vicious ad campaign against the competition, and create a US-based team to develop games for American audiences. This plan didn't sit well with the Japanese board of directors, but the president of Sega of Japan, Hayao Nakayama, trusted Kalinski's judgment and gave him the green light. This plan turned out to be a huge success, and Sega started to dominate the North American market, allowing all the bigwigs at both branches to partake in creating their own roller coasters in their backyards and create jetpacks powered by farts. Now, before I continue, let's talk about Sonic the Hedgehog, because I'd be doing this video a gross disservice by leaving that as a footnote in this video. Before Sonic became the mascot of Sega and then the laughingstock of the gaming industry, the previous mascot was a character named Alex Kidd, a character that only had 6 games under his belt, most of which were on the Master System, and has pretty much faded into obscurity. Sega wasn't really satisfied with Alex and wanted to create a new character that would be as iconic as Mickey Mouse and serve as a true rival to Mario. Now, whether Sonic ended up becoming as iconic as Mickey, I have no idea, nor did I really bother to research it, but one thing's for sure, he did end up serving as a true rival to our favorite mustachioed plumber. The game, of course, ended up being a massive success, even being declared as one of the greatest video games yet, and was a major system seller for the Genesis. It was even responsible for creating a craze of animal mascot platformers, most of which were terrible, by the way. The most infamous out of all of them being Bubsy.
What could possibly go wrong?
If you're amazed that we even bothered mentioning him, I am amazed that someone believed that it would be a good idea to bring him back. Twice. Really, there are some games that you really shouldn't bring back. Seriously, get that Necromancer out of the video game graveyard. Now for the Super Nintendo, in Japan, the Super Famicom, which was the Japanese Super Nintendo, came out in 1990, 2 years after the release of the Genesis / Mega Drive, which shall be referred to solely as the Genesis from here on. It was the most powerful console on the market, with specs that vastly outstripped its main competitors, the PC Engine and the Genesis, with the exception of processing speed, in which the Genesis had an edge. While the PC Engine and Genesis were enjoying huge success, when the Super Famicom came out, it quickly outsold the other two and took its place as the dominant console in Japan. In North America, however, the Super Nintendo ended up facing challenges. It was 2 years late to the party and had a few things going against it. In the 2 years since its release, Sega had slashed down the price of the Genesis to $150, making it more affordable than the $200 Super Nintendo, and it had more of a library to offer as the Super Nintendo only had 3 games at launch: F-Zero, Pilot Wings, and one of my personal favorite games, Super Mario World. Because of this slow start, the Super Nintendo was being outsold 2-1 by the Genesis in its first year. Another issue Nintendo had on their plate was their censorship policy. As I said earlier, when the NES came out, it was primarily marketed towards children, and it was for that reason why Nintendo implemented that censorship policy. This strategy didn't change with the SNES, and served as a detriment to them. Sega managed to take advantage of this and marketed their console as the more adult system, and let games with uncensored violence onto the Genesis, which helped make the system more appealing to teens and adults. The flaws of Nintendo's censorship policy really became apparent with the release of Mortal Kombat in 1992, where the Genesis version of the game had all the uncut blood and gore of the arcade game, while Nintendo's version was censored to oblivion. Because of this, the sales of the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat vastly outstripped that of Nintendo's version of the game. It's worth noting though that the release of Mortal Kombat as well as the release of Doom and Night Trap later on sparked the video game violence controversy, in which people started to believe that the people who played violent video games would warp the minds of people who played them, and that those players would start to act out that violence in real life. This caused such a moral panic that the United States Congress opened hearings in 1993 to investigate the matter and decide whether or not the video game industry should be subject to government regulation. This, of course, shook the industry to its core, and as a response, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, was formed to give ratings similar to that of the Motion Picture Association of America for films, so that people would know which age group a game would be made for as proof that the industry can regulate itself. This only partially worked. While Congress did back off after the ESRB was formed, the video game violence controversy still persisted and even increased in its intensity after the Columbine High School massacre in 1999, which led to lawyers like Jack Thompson, as well as politicians like Hillary Clinton, making several attempts to regulate the industry and censor violent video games. The controversy, although having died down significantly since Thompson's disbarment in 2008, still popped up every now and again, and managed to be replaced by several other controversies, such as the more recent loot box controversy that has once again made it possible for government intervention and regulation, as the industry has failed to prove that it can regulate itself, as it actively tries to defend this predatory practice. But these are subjects for future videos. After the ESRB was formed, Nintendo felt that it was no longer necessary to keep up this censorship policy, and started to let games like Mortal Kombat 2 on the system completely uncensored. Now, while this video does indeed make things seem as if they were doom and gloom for the Super Nintendo, it really wasn't. Far from it, in fact. Though I think most of you can probably figure that out unless you are somehow watching this video in the past. While Sega did have the advantage early on, that didn't last. While games on the SNES were censored, games generally weren't censored that badly. Very few games were really censored to the point of severity. Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III as it was known back then due to 2, 3, and 5 not getting a US release, had quite a few examples of censorship, and despite all that, it was still one of the most beloved games on the SNES, with a lasting popularity that to this day even rivals that of its sequel Final Fantasy VII. The competition was extremely fierce, and each system was home to some great exclusives that went toe-to-toe with their rivals. While Sega did have the Sonic games as well as Ristar, Nintendo had Mario and Kirby to match them. Nintendo had Final Fight, while Sega had the superior Streets of Rage games. Seriously, 3 of the best beat-em-ups ever made. And while Sega had Phantasy Star, the SNES was an RPG hub, and was home to many great RPGs, like the Final Fantasy games, Breath of Fire 1 and 2, Secret of Mana, and Chrono Trigger, which again, is perhaps the greatest RPG ever made. But ultimately, it was Nintendo that had the more recognizable and iconic classics than the Genesis. I mean, sure, Sega had Echo the Dolphin, Altered Beast, Golden Axe, and Castlevania Bloodlines, but Nintendo had Mega Man X, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, Super Castlevania 4, Turtles in Time, and the Donkey Kong Country games. As the years passed, the flaws of the Genesis became more visible, and this was especially highlighted by the multi-platform games released on both consoles. As the Super Nintendo had the higher specs, including a significantly higher color palette than that of the Genesis, multi-platform games like Street Fighter II and Spider-Man Maximum Carnage generally tended to look and sound better on the Super Nintendo. There were exceptions like Earthworm Jim and Mickey Mania, but those were very few and far in between. Another issue with the Genesis was its 3-button controller. As games were getting more advanced, they started to require more buttons to use to expand the amount of control you have. Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat highlighted this, as you were capable of performing more moves with the Super Nintendo's 6-button controller, while you were limited by the 3-button controller on the Sega Genesis. Sega caught on to this flaw and fixed it by releasing a smaller 6-button controller. Now, the Yamaha sound chip, while it could belt out some really great music on games exclusive to the Genesis, couldn't really hold a candle to the SSMP sound chip on the Super Nintendo, developed by Sony, by the way. Oh boy, is that harsh in hindsight, but that's another video. As a result, multi-platform games tended to sound worse on the Genesis. The Model 1 Genesis also had this issue where it only used mono sound on TV sets, and while it was capable of stereo sound, you had to use the system's headphone jack in order to listen to it. This issue was fixed with the release of the Model 2 system, where they got rid of the headphone jack and used stereo sound on TVs. Can you imagine a time where games not only were not in surround sound, but also couldn't even do sound in stereo? Hard times indeed. We all look at our sound bars now and tuck them in at night and give them a nice little kiss and whisper softly, "It's okay, mono sound isn't real, it's just a fairy tale." Sega, of course, tried to compensate for their shortcomings by latching onto the only hardware advantage they had, which was the higher processing speed. Their ads tried to market this as blast processing.
So what's blast processing do?
But this only served to make Sega look desperate, as nobody really knew what blast processing actually was. And Sega really didn't give an explanation. From the ads alone, one could only assume that the games were faster on the Genesis, and technically, that is correct. Due to the higher processing speed, the Genesis did allow for more fast-paced gameplay than you can get on the SNES, but outside of some exclusives like Sonic the Hedgehog, very few games took advantage of it. The only games that really helped were sports games. Sports. The least interesting genre in gaming, in my opinion at least. And then we had the add-ons. Oh god, the add-ons. This is where things really started to get messy. Since blast processing didn't really mean anything, Sega decided to release a couple of add-ons for the Genesis so they could have hardware that could surpass that of the SNES as well as extend the life of the Genesis. The first add-on was the Sega CD in 1992. Back then, CD technology was pretty new, and every gaming company making consoles at the time wanted to take advantage of it. Before we get to that though, now I believe is a good time to start talking about the competition. Now, Sega and Nintendo weren't the only companies producing consoles at the time. During the 4th gen, there were plenty of consoles in competition with the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. One of them was the PC Engine, which I've mentioned a couple of times in this video already. The PC Engine came out a year before the Mega Drive in Japan. So, much like the Mega Drive, it was originally meant to compete with the Famicom, but ended up competing with the 16-bit consoles shortly after its release. When it came out in North America, it ended up coming out 2 weeks after the Genesis under the name TurboGrafx-16. At the time, game companies would often advertise how powerful their consoles were in bits, referring to a console's CPU. I'm not going to bore you with the details on what exactly bits are, but I will tell you that Sega especially loved to boast about their 16-bit machines, to the point where they even slapped a 16-bit in huge lettering on the Model 1 console. The TurboGrafx-16 would also advertise itself as a 16-bit console. With the 16 in the name, however, this claim was called into question, as the system only used an 8-bit CPU. The system had quite a few great games on it, like Bonk's Adventure, Neutopia, Splatterhouse, and Dragon's Curse. But sadly, the system didn't really catch on in North America, selling only 10 million units. In Japan, however, it's a different story, as the PC Engine sold really well to the point where it consistently outsold the Mega Drive and was the second best-selling console in Japan. The Genesis may have been a leading competitor for a while in North America, but in its home country of Japan, it only saw moderate success. There was also the SNK Neo Geo AES, which upon release in 1990 had the best hardware you could get at the time. It wasn't really a competitor per se, as it was originally only available for rent to places like hotels and bars, as it was insanely expensive at a whopping $650, which, if you adjust for inflation, is the equivalent of $1,196 now. Surprisingly though, people were actually willing to buy such an expensive system, and SNK decided to sell it to the public at large, even releasing a cheaper variant at $400 or $736 today. So it was still a very, very expensive system. And if that wasn't expensive enough, the games were also more pricey than most other systems at the time, as each game was sold for $300 a pop. As you can imagine, the system didn't really sell all that well, as it only sold about 980,000 units. This was pretty much a system that only the super rich could really afford. But the quality of games were really superb. And then there's the Jaguar. I guess we really need to talk about this thing, don't we? You'd think after having the Atari 5200 and 7800 fail that they'd throw in the towel, but as it turns out, they were gluttons for punishment. To give them some credit, they actually tried making a system that could really compete with the Genesis and SNES instead of releasing a system with just home versions of arcade games on it again. They claimed to have the most advanced console on the market, with a whopping 64 bits, complete with an ad where a scary, mentally unstable lady tells us to do the math.
Jaguar, Jaguar, Jaguar!
However, like the TurboGrafx-16, the Jaguar's claim also faced scrutiny and criticism, as it was found out that it really didn't have a 64-bit CPU. Instead, it had two 32-bit CPUs, and somehow they thought that made it 64-bit. It also had weirdly designed cartridges with handles on them. For what reason, I don't know. My best guess is that Atari thought it would make it easier to pull the game out of the console. The controllers were also pretty weird, as they were huge and bulky, with only 3 buttons and a keypad, which very few games really took advantage of. Like Sega, Atari found out that 3 buttons were not enough for the new games coming out, and they replaced it with an 8-button controller, and we won't even talk about the keypad. As for the games, while it did have a couple of good games like Alien vs Predator and Tempest 2000, unfortunately most of the games on the Jaguar were just terrible, and it had a hard time trying to compete. While we'd love to take some time to talk about the horrible Doom port on the Jaguar, we should really be moving along. Another thing that happened during this generation was the release of the compact disc format, or CDs as we all know them. It was a revolutionary format capable of massive storage compared to any other format at the time, and had more capabilities in video and sound. Of course, the industry jumped at the chance to take advantage of this new technology, and in the early 90s we saw either add-ons for the 4th gen consoles, or new systems entirely using the brand new format. The first system to take advantage of this was the CDI, and like the Jaguar, I can't believe we're even talking about this thing, but talking about crap consoles is what this channel does best. Though, to be fair to this system, it was originally meant to be a multimedia player rather than a game console. Basically the idea the Xbox One went with when it was announced in 2013. Though that was a mistake as well.
TV, sports TV.
No matter what way you slice it though, the system was nothing but hot garbage. It had absolutely nothing to offer, unless you liked playing crap games that don't work properly. It had around 20 movies that you were probably better off watching on VHS at the time, and are most certainly better off watching on Blu-ray today. Seriously, you want some true entertainment? Go watch Big Trouble in Little China. Interactive documentaries, and you can't see it, but I'm using air quotes around both interactive and documentaries, because most of these titles were neither. It also had a garbage selection of games, but I think you've worked that out already. It really didn't have any titles that you could say were worthwhile. And of course, it had 4 very special games that I will get to in a bit. As you can imagine, it crashed and burned. Everyone who made it changed their names, got facial reconstruction surgery, and moved to other countries to hide their shame. Another company to throw their hat into the ring was the 3DO company with the 3DO. This was another console that went for the title of most advanced console on the market with their new 32-bit system, which, in case you're not noticing a trend, almost every time that happens, it never results in top sales. Take the hint, Microsoft! Their ad campaign also targeted the SNES and Genesis, with an ad where the two systems were locked into a toy chest with the tagline, "Put away the toys."
If you're not playing on a 3DO system, what are you playing with? Presenting 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
Although those two toys still ended up kicking its proverbial behind, as well as future 32-bit systems. There were some odd decisions made with this system, including releasing a 5-button controller at a time where 6-button controllers were becoming a necessity. It may have only been 1 button short, but that 1 button can make a huge difference. The console only had 1 controller port, so in order to play multiplayer games, you had to daisy chain the controller together by plugging the second player controller into the first one. Fun fact, our editor actually found one of these controllers in their closet when they were a kid. Unsure of how it got there, but remembered it also being one of the most bizarre controllers ever. Yeah, that sounds like a great design choice. Put player 1 in a position where they have to deal with player 2 tugging their controller with each movement. I'm sure that won't get annoying. It was also the most expensive console on the market, with a price of $700, the equivalent of $1,214 today. Its library, like most others that tried to challenge the Genesis and Super Nintendo, wasn't really impressive either. While it did have a few games to its name like Gex, Crash and Burn, Battle Sports, Escape from Monster Manor, and Samurai Showdown, the library was unfortunately watered down by FMV games, and that, along with the high price, turned people off of the 3DO. FMV, or full motion video, was this experiment with disc technology to combine the experience of movies with that of games, except this was before the days of Heavy Rain or Until Dawn. The first FMV game was the arcade game Dragon's Lair in the 80s. It was a cartoon made of QuickTime events. As you watched the movie, you had to press a certain button at the right time in order to progress. The game used Laserdisc, and as the Laserdisc systems as well as the discs themselves were huge, bulky, and expensive at the time, the industry didn't see it as worth tapping into. There were attempts to bring Dragon's Lair to the NES and SNES, but they turned out horribly. With the compact disc and the technology needed to play it being smaller and cheaper than the Laserdisc and its tech, the gaming industry thought it would be a good time to take advantage of it. FMV games would typically come in the form of a movie with QuickTime events like Dragon's Lair, Road Adventure, or Night Trap, or they would come in the form of light gun games with filmed cutscenes and digitized actors. While there were a couple of good ones here and there, most of the genre ended up being pretty terrible or boring. The worst example was a game called Plumbers Don't Wear Ties on the 3DO, a game with a plot that was complete nonsense. Gameplay was non-existent aside from a couple of choices here and there, and most of the game was in slides. Aside from the opening, there's no real full motion video to be found. And the slideshow was an eyesore, as you could often see these obnoxious filters. Why they kept playing around with filters, I have no idea. There was even an unedited blooper mid-game, so that just goes to show you there really wasn't any care put into this. This game is so non-interactive that you can actually experience the entire game on YouTube via videos. I'm dead serious. The only thing missing is experiencing how the controls would get stuck until dialogue was over. So, actually watching it on YouTube is an improvement over the original game. Needless to say, having a library full of these games was practically a death sentence for the 3DO. The TurboGrafx-16 also had a CD add-on and even had a variant of the system called the Turbo Duo with a CD slot built into the system. Unlike other companies that thought FMV was the future, NEC was more interested in bringing actual games to the system, and a lot of them were pretty good. It had Lords of Thunder, Godzilla, Siri Shenchi Springen, again, keep in mind the system was a lot more popular in Japan, Buster Brothers, Cotton Fantastic Night Dreams, Valis 4, and of course, its most well-known title, and what is considered to be one of the best Castlevania games, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. It also had the first Street Fighter on there, called Fighting Street. Although it wasn't very well regarded, but if you want to see where Street Fighter began, the Turbo Duo was one of the few consoles that had a port of it. Again, the TurboGrafx-16 didn't sell nearly as well as the Super Nintendo or Genesis in North America, but it is still a great system worth checking out, and the CD system is region-free if you want to check out the great games Japan had to offer. The Jaguar also had a CD add-on, but it really didn't help the system out. The add-on was regarded as fragile and prone to loading problems, and it is rather difficult to find a working Jaguar CD today. Even if you did manage to find a working Jaguar CD, there aren't really that many games worth playing on it. Like the regular Jaguar, the Jaguar CD's library was mostly made up of crap games. Its best regarded title to my knowledge was Cybermorph. Another issue is that the add-on made the system resemble a toilet. And I know what you're thinking, oh haha, another toilet joke, like I haven't heard that one before. But to be fair, just look at it. Really, look at it. At this point, I think it's safe to say that the toilet comments are pretty much obligatory when looking at the Jaguar CD. You can't just look at it and not think about toilets. It's ingrained into our brains at this point. I see this thing, and I want to run to the bathroom. SNK also decided to release a CD replacement for the Neo Geo called the Neo Geo CD. This console would have the same capabilities of the Neo Geo and would have the same library. The console would still be expensive at $399, but it would still be a much cheaper alternative to the original. It would also be much cheaper to buy games for it as well, due to CDs being a much cheaper medium than cartridges. Rather than having to shell out $300 for a single game on a Neo Geo cartridge, a Neo Geo CD game would typically run for about $50 to $80. However, this would turn out to be too little too late for SNK, as this was released in 1994 and had two major flaws. One was that the load times were pretty slow and could take up to a minute to load anything. The other flaw was that the Neo Geo CD, like the AES, was only capable of 2D graphics, and it was released just a year before the Sega Saturn and PlayStation made their debut. Ultimately, it was too late for them to compete with the 4th gen consoles, and it would be unable to compete with the 5th gen systems. As a result, the system only ended up selling 570,000 units. And this brings us all the way back to the Sega CD, an add-on meant to keep up with the competition, take advantage of this new format, and extend the life of the Genesis. Even though one could argue that wasn't really necessary, as it was still a good system on its own right. But since NEC had already released their add-on and Nintendo had plans to release its own CD add-on, Sega wanted to take advantage and one-up the competition. This didn't end too well for Sega. While it did have some good titles like Sonic CD, much like the 3DO, the Sega CD's library was bogged down by FMV games. Not only that, but the video quality of the Sega CD was pretty much terrible, which generally made these FMV games look even worse as they were often letterboxed, grainy, and discolored. VHS tapes literally had better video quality than the Sega CD. Now their sprite-based games, they look fantastic if done well. It's just a shame that there are so few noteworthy games on the Sega CD. As for Nintendo's CD add-on, it didn't pan out. Nintendo was working on one with Sony, and it even made it to the prototype stage. The SNES CD, as it was known, was going to be called the PlayStation. I think you know where I am going with this. Now, it's hard to tell what would have happened if the Super Nintendo PlayStation add-on was released. Everything we know about it is based on the prototype that was found in 2015. Based on the specs of the prototype, it was probably going to be as powerful as your standard SNES. All the CD add-on would do is open up compatibility with a medium that would allow for more storage space than a cartridge, allowing developers to do a lot more with their games without having to worry about system limitations. Now, unfortunately, this didn't pan out, as Nintendo had scorned Sony by backing out of the deal and made a deal with Philips to produce the add-on instead. That deal also didn't pan out, and instead of getting a CD add-on, what happened instead was that there was one terrible Mario game and 3 terrible Zelda games, fittingly nicknamed the Unholy Triforce on the CDI. These games would be infamous for their poor design and especially for their incredibly badly drawn cutscenes.
You've killed me!
Good.
This would come back as memes on YouTube to be laughed at and used in jokes for years to come. Nintendo, when they scorned Sony, must have been channeling Atari, as that decision came back to bite them when the PlayStation came back as a line of consoles that would haunt Nintendo for generations. After the Sega CD turned out to be a flop, which, shocker, in 1994, Sega released an add-on to expand the specs of the Genesis even further called the 32X, because, hey, why not just try the same strategy over and over again until it works, right? This add-on had 32-bit Super H2 processors, making the add-on capable of early 32-bit graphics. This was made as a response to, of all consoles, the Atari Jaguar. Okay, yes, we all laugh now, but in the mid-90s when the Jaguar was announced, it must have seemed like a serious threat. That really doesn't excuse Sega though, as the release of the 32X itself didn't make sense, as it was launched 1 year away from their next console, the Sega Saturn. To top it off, they came to the conclusion that, hey, maybe it's asking a little too much to get new customers to buy a Genesis and a 32X to go with it. They were going to release it as its own console, called the Sega Neptune, which, again, would have been a terrible idea since they were going to release the Saturn. I mean, geez, if they wanted to make something that could outclass the Jaguar, they should have just done nothing. As they had a console that was going to outclass it anyway. The very existence of the 32X makes no sense. All it tells us is that Sega at the time had poor decision-making skills after the Super Nintendo came onto the market. It had only 40 games on it, and the vast majority of them were mediocre titles. As you can imagine, it flopped. It even sports one of the ugliest versions of Doom that actually has a soundtrack recorded via people farting into the microphones. The only version that is worse is the GBA version. The console war also extended to the handheld market. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, the first real handheld on the market. Before the Game Boy, all gaming really had in terms of handhelds were really basic LCD games like the Game & Watch line, providing very limited gameplay. This was a game changer, as it was the first handheld where you could get a gameplay experience that was practically on par with what you can get on consoles. It was a gray brick with a simple pea green LCD screen that displayed games with 8-bit monochrome, or black and white graphics. It took 4 AA batteries that gave the system an impressive 12-hour battery life. The only downside to this was that there was no backlight, so in order to see what's on the screen, you had to be in a well-lit area or sit in the sun. To be fair, there were peripherals that provided front light so that you could see the screen. I had a couple, but they really didn't work all that well. The screen was still pretty hard to see. Believe it or not, Nintendo had absolutely no faith in the system, with the staff calling it a lame system, kind of harsh since it's still the first handheld console, and a hopeless endeavor. To their pleasant surprise, they were proven wrong. The Game Boy sold out its entire stock in Japan after its release, and it sold 40,000 units on its first day in the United States. It even had games to back the system up. When it was released, it was bundled with Tetris, which had many players instantly hooked. And it also had Super Mario Land as the launch title to show off what the gray brick was capable of. People were surprised and delighted that Super Mario Land provided a gameplay experience just like that of an NES Super Mario Bros. Game, just with less levels and monochrome. As the years passed, all the franchises people loved found its way to the Game Boy, including The Legend of Zelda, Castlevania, Mega Man, Donkey Kong, Bomberman, and Battletoads. There were even big IPs that made their debut on the Game Boy, such as Kirby and Pokemon. The Game Boy had a surprisingly long lifespan, lasting from 1989 all the way to 2003. It may have been a simple brick, but its fantastic library made it a fan favorite among gamers. Of course, Sega tried to get into the handheld market as well. In 1990 in Japan and 1991 in North America, they released the Sega Game Gear as a competitor to the Game Boy. This behemoth of a system boasted a full color display, 8-bit graphic capabilities that even surpassed the Master System, and a backlit screen. While this sounds nice, there were downsides. The screen was pretty washed out, making it extremely difficult to see unless you held the system at the right angle. I can tell you this out of experience, say what you will about the Game Boy screen, while you can't play it in the dark unless you mod an original or a pocket or import the Game Boy Light, you'll still have an easier time seeing on the Game Boy than the Game Gear. If you play it outside during the day or play it in a lit room, you'll have no issues. With the Game Gear, it's a pain in the rear to see in the light or the dark, and when you find that right angle, you have to hold it in a position that, in my opinion, is very awkward. The Game Gear was also a battery-eating monster. It took 6 AA batteries, but only gave you about 3 to 5 hours of gameplay compared to the Game Boy's 12 hours on 4 batteries.
I don't know if you really want to get into what you find in the trash.
Though to be fair, if you had a Genesis, it would actually allow you to use the power cord to play in lieu of batteries. Worth mentioning, probably just stopped a bunch of comments. Point is, you'd have to change batteries more often on a Game Gear than a Game Boy. As you can imagine, ads for the Game Gear were quite vicious towards the Game Boy as well.
Some people are content to be entertained by simple one-color electronics. Somehow these people have just never heard of Game Gear, the multicolor portable from Sega with tons of new titles. Yeah, some people are like that, but then some people like to eat pickled pork lips. System and games sold separately.
One particular ad attacked fans of the Game Boy with the quote, "If you were colorblind and had an IQ of less than 12, then you probably wouldn't mind which portable you had." Nintendo, who never released an attack ad throughout the entire console war, thought that even this was going too far and called Sega out for insulting people who were mentally disabled, even going as far as to seeking to arrange protests. Sega, in response, would put their arrogance on full display, with Tom Kalinske saying Nintendo should spend more time improving their products and marketing rather than working on behind-the-scenes coercive activities. Just imagine someone trying to pull such an ad in this day and age. They'd be ripped to shreds in seconds. Now, while this bit of controversy would have no impact on sales, probably due to the fact that the internet wasn't quite as big as it is now and Twitter wasn't a thing, Tom Kalinske would still end up with egg on his face as the relatively little, simplistic monochrome Game Boy utterly trounced the more advanced Game Gear, proving once again that you don't need more advanced hardware to be the better system. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the Game Gear here. By all means, it did have its fair share of good games. However, it did have a significantly weaker selection than the Game Boy did. What happened was that Sega's resources were stretched thin at this point. Sega was putting most of their focus on the Genesis as well as the CD and 32X add-ons. Not only that, but they were also putting their focus on developing the Sega Saturn. With all that on their plate, Sega had very little room to focus on the Game Gear, and as a result, it couldn't match the Game Boy, which was vastly outselling it. If the superior library and battery life with just 4 AA batteries weren't enough, the Game Boy also managed to deal a crippling blow to the Game Gear with its first revision, the Game Boy Pocket. This revision came with a sharper black and white screen than that of the original model, which made it much easier to see, and reduced the amount of ghosting on screen. It also had the same battery life of 12 hours, but reduced the size and number of batteries from 4 AA's to 2 AAA's, allowing Nintendo to slim down the system significantly, making the Game Boy Pocket thin enough to slip into the front or back pocket of your jeans, as the name implies. This further reduction of size and number of batteries needed while maintaining the hours of gameplay provided made the tiny Game Boy Pocket all that much more desirable than the battery-consuming behemoth that was the Game Gear. There were also plans for a 16-bit handheld as a successor to the Game Gear, but those plans fell through as Sega had enough on its plate. As it turns out, releasing tons of consoles really didn't do much for sales. But what did happen was that they ended up making a handheld variant of the Genesis known as the Sega Nomad. And you have to admit, that sounds to this day pretty awesome. Being able to take the Genesis wherever you want and play your favorite games while you're sitting in transit or are in the middle of a flight or sitting in a waiting room? Imagine if Sony was able to make a fully capable version of the PS4 that you can take anywhere. Only there are 2 issues with that though. The thing was pretty bulky. Probably even more so than the Game Gear, had the same screen issues that the Game Gear had, took as much batteries, and had an even lower battery life. Those 6 AA's would be drained in 2 to 3 hours. It really seemed that Sega was a company that made the same mistakes over and over again. Sega made a rechargeable battery pack for the Nomad so that people wouldn't have to keep constantly buying and replacing batteries, but still, that only added more bulk to the system, and more stuff for you to lug around, as you'd have to recharge it constantly. There was enough stuff for this thing that a child would need to fill his entire backpack with it just to use this thing at the schoolyard and show off to his friends. But the idea of a handheld that could play Genesis games was an idea that still appeals to gamers to this day, and since then we've seen everything from handhelds that could emulate the Genesis to clone console handhelds. Whatever your feelings on the Nomad, just know this: it had a great idea and was still certainly better than any of the Genesis handhelds AtGames churned out many years later. AtGames is garbage, and they deserve all the scorn we can muster.
I don't know if you really want to get into what you find in the trash.
Oh, and also the Atari Lynx was a thing. Most of the hardware problems with the Game Gear and Nomad could be applied to this system. A backlit color screen that could also be difficult to see due to how washed out the screen is, and it was also a bulky battery-consuming monster that'll drain a large number of batteries in 3 to 5 hours. And of course, the thing that did the Lynx in, a library of mediocre titles. Atari after the 2600 would fail time and time again. Their 5200 failed due to a crappy controller and being released a year away from the crash. They turned down a deal with Nintendo in favor of the 7800 that just entirely recycled the library of past systems, and they turned down a deal with Sega in favor of the Lynx and Jaguar that would fail spectacularly due to a poor library of games. After the Jaguar, we thought that was it for Atari as they bowed out of the console market entirely. And then, in the late 2010s, a necromancer went to the video game graveyard and brought Atari back. Atari then proceeded to go on a rampage, releasing a bunch of crappy games on Steam, and are on their way to release a mid-range game console called the Atari VCS for $300. Yeah, I'm sure this is going to really fly off the shelves. It's already surrounded with controversy as it seems to be mostly just a Linux PC that emulates games. I can't help but feel we have already seen something like that before. In the end, while the Sega Genesis was the top dog early on, Sega's poor decision making would eventually do it in. While they produced a lot of great games for the Genesis, after a while, the games stopped being the main focus. Sega fell into this trap thinking that having the most advanced hardware automatically makes it the best system on the market. When, on the contrary, it's not the hardware that makes the system, it's the games, and you can look as far back as the second gen to see this. Despite the glut of systems that came out, the Atari 2600 proved itself to be the king of the second gen consoles. Not even its own direct successor could overtake it, and the Sega Master System in the third generation, despite boasting superior hardware, just couldn't compete against the NES. And as I just said, their Game Gear with its superior graphics, backlit screen, and full color display couldn't overthrow a simple monochrome brick. And Sega, in its pursuit of having the most advanced hardware on the market, completely forgot about having the best library. I could continue on about how this put Sega on the path to failure with the Saturn and the Dreamcast, but I think you get the idea. As for Nintendo, they didn't put out any advanced add-ons in the end. While they did have the idea to create a CD add-on, eventually they decided to cancel and put all their focus into the very thing that mattered: the games. They decided they didn't need to produce any fancy add-ons to make their hardware more advanced. Instead, they went with a different tactic. And they, along with a few third parties, decided to put enhancement chips in the cartridges to pull off feats they couldn't pull off with the SNES hardware alone. The most famous of these enhancement chips was the Super FX chip. This chip made it so that developers could program very early 3D graphics into their games. And it worked. Nintendo came out with Yoshi's Island that had some objects rendered in 3D that could be used as platforms or could very well harm you in-game. This was an impressive feat, but what really took everyone by surprise was Star Fox, a game that was entirely in 3D and really showed off what Nintendo could do simply by putting a chip in the cartridge while their competition released expensive hardware to expand the capabilities of their systems. Oh, and there was also a really awful Doom port released via the Super FX chip. And since we are taking potshots at Sega for their crap port of Doom on the 32X, I felt it only fair to bring this up too. We will never forgive crappy Doom ports here at 2UpBox. Never. They did make an add-on, of course. They had the Super Game Boy, but this add-on was similar to the Power Base converter for the Genesis, which introduced backwards compatibility with Master System games. The Super Game Boy, as the name implies, was made so that if you weren't on the go, instead of playing your Game Boy games on your handheld that required you to be under a light in order to see it, you could just pop it in the Super Game Boy cartridge and pop that into your SNES so you could play it on your TV. This obviously increased the library of games that the SNES had access to significantly. Nintendo's focus on games would put the Super Nintendo on the path to success, and in 1995 overtook the Genesis and took its place as king of the 4th gen consoles. After the 4th generation, there would never be another console war that would be quite as intense. With this generation, we saw companies constantly trying to one-up each other while slamming the competitions with scores of attack ads, something that we would never really see again. Not to mention, the competition would never be quite as balanced. Nintendo would never claim such a victory again, as they made mistakes that would cost them their dominance, and soon, they would just stop trying to be top dog and settle for being a secondary console. While they were still massively successful, they would never truly sit on the top of the sales charts again with their home consoles. I mean, there was the Wii, but we'll talk about that in another video. Nintendo would continue to be the dominant company in the handheld market, but in the console market, they would be known as secondary consoles. As I mentioned, consoles that you could get enjoyment out of, but would have such a lack of selection in games that you would need another system to go with it for those third-party titles or multi-platform games. However, since the launch of the Switch, things have been looking up for Nintendo. Sega, on the other hand, would follow Atari's path in making colossal mistake after colossal mistake that would see them bowing out of the console market entirely. And the 5th and 6th generations would see the rise of two competitors that arguably rule the market to this day. However, the rivalry between Sony and Microsoft would never be as intense as the competition between Sega and Nintendo, with all the squabbling being left to the fanboys. Although, in the 8th gen, Sony would take a couple of cheeky jabs at Microsoft.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
But it wouldn't be quite as vicious as Sega's attack ads. The Super Nintendo and the Genesis left behind a legacy that would see them become fan favorites to this day, as they produced scores of great games that people have fond memories of and left behind hidden gems that are worth checking out. The two are so popular to this day that people want to see more and more ports of these old games re-released on the current gen systems, and there are even plenty of clone consoles being made out of them, like the Hyperkin or Retrobit systems or Analog's high-end clones like the Super NT and the Mega SG. There are plenty of great games on these systems, so I recommend checking these out however you can. Anyway, this is 2UpBox, and thank you all for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one, and hit the notification bell to be kept up to date on our videos. And tell us your experiences with the SNES and the Genesis in the comments down below. I hope you all have a fantastic day.